Thanks so much for being here this evening. My name's Jenny, and I work in the Office of Philanthropic Partnerships and Alumni, real mouthful, specifically in the York for Life team. So our priority over at York for Life is engaging with alumni. We want to hear about the great things you're getting up to, but also to reconnect you with the great things that are happening at the uni. So this event really came from that. We were thinking about what makes York great, what's magic about the city. And obviously one of the first things we always think about is the Minster. Well, I hope you think about it. Luckily, I was connected with Professor Sarah Brown. She's the lead for our MA in Stained Glass Conservation and Heritage Management, and she's been overseeing the restoration of the St William window in the Minster. She's kindly agreed to speak tonight on a fascinating piece of history that's been rediscovered during the restoration. So I'm going to pass you across to Sarah for the presentation, and hope you enjoy it.
Thank you very much, Jenny. I hope everyone can hear me. It's lovely to know that so many people all over the world who are keen on the Minster and on stained glass in York have joined us this evening. I'm going to talk about something which is very close to my heart, the rediscovery of a remarkable woman called Beatrice de Roos, who I think I can confidently say was probably one of the most important, if not the most important, secular patrons of York Minster in the medieval period. So let me introduce you to Beatrice. She was the Dowager Baroness Roos. She was probably born in about 1338, and I think she was the third daughter of Ralph Earl Stafford. He was a very successful social climber in the reign of Edward III. He was a very successful courtier and eventually became an earl and enriched his family, and particularly took care to make sure that his three daughters were very well married. Beatrice was married 3 times. First of all, she was Countess Desmond for a very brief period. She then became Baroness Roos on the death of her first husband, and eventually she became Lady Burleigh. And her third husband was a Knight of the Garter and very close to the centre of Lancastrian politics. She made her will in June 1414, and she died not very long after in April 1415. And I'm showing you the image of Beatrice as she now appears at the foot of the Great East Window. Women patrons of stained glass are a particularly interesting phenomenon. All too often, we only really see the tip of this particular iceberg, usually in the form of a woman who is there as an appendage, if you like, of her elite husband. And this is a good example in Poitiers Cathedral. This is the east window with an image of the famous Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine accompanying King Henry II. And as you can see, they're jointly offering up an image of a window. But Eleanor is there very much as an adjunct to her royal husband. Elsewhere in manuscript art, of course, the famous Luttrell Psalter shows Geoffrey Luttrell's wife offering him up the various accoutrements he needs to go off to fight in a battle, and indeed their daughter-in-law is there also offering up a shield. And from York Minster in the North Nave aisle, an image of a woman, a man and a woman, probably a married couple, who appear together in attitudes of prayer, kneeling at the foot of the window in postures that suggest that they are part of the patronage circle associated with the window. Elsewhere, when we see women, I think we find that all too often, they are rather not exactly infantilized, but they're shown in light-hearted, entertaining pursuits. So we have here the Luttrell Psalter and the Ormsby Psalter, both from about the year 1340. And we see here women with a woman with a musical instrument and another one who is receiving a love token while clutching a small pet, apparently a squirrel. The man who accompanies her, of course, is altogether more seriously involved. He seems to be about to go off hawking. So where did my interest in Beatrice start? Well, it was basically one of those rabbit holes that one was tending to go down during the lockdown period. I was supposedly on a sabbatical and I'd retreated, as we all had, to our homes, taking with me lots of photographs and books about a project I'd just recently begun, which was actually not so much looking at the St. William window, but looking at a window in the choir clerestory of the Minster. And at the bottom of the window, I found a coat of arms. I've shown it up on the top left-hand corner of the screen, which I quickly identified as being somehow connected with the Roos family. And with a bit more digging, I realised that this was actually Beatrice de Roos, and it was specifically a commemoration of a married woman. And when I looked more widely at the other coats of arms in this part of the Minster, I realised that this was a unique example of a tribute to a married woman, which just got me digging a little bit deeper. And I realised that there were other coats of arms associated with Beatrice de Roos, not least the arms of her husband, Thomas Lord Roos, which appears carved in stone in the south choir arcade. And you can see that the coat of arms is, as it were, sort of slung over his shoulders. It's a sort of naturalistic bust, presumably intended to convey a sense of Thomas himself supporting his coat of arms. He has made no reference here in this carved stone coat to his wife. But of course, by the time that this stained glass shield is made, it was common for a woman to be, in a married woman, to be indicated by the so-called impalement of her husband's coat of arms with those of her father. And that was how I was able to identify this as the shield of Beatrice. So I then began looking for more indications of Beatrice as somehow involved in art and in the patronage of craftspeople. And I discovered that several impressions of a personal seal of Beatrice de Roos survived in public collections. And this is one that's the best preserved impression of her seal, which is preserved in the British Library. And it tells us that this is the shield of Beatrice de Roos. Her name appears on the shield. And this particular version of the shield, with this distinctive coat of arms in the centre, could not have been in use before 1385 because it includes the arms of her third husband, Richard Burley, but it appears on documents which can be dated from their content to 1388, 1404 and 1414. So she seems to have been using it to manage her affairs in her third and final widowhood. The shield is the shield of arms in the centre of the seal is very interesting because you can see, I hope, that it combines, if you can see my pointer, it combines on the extreme left-hand side the arms of her husband Thomas Roos, on the right-hand side the arms of her third husband Richard Burley, and in the centre of the shield the arms of her father. And they have been fused in this particular and rather unusual arrangement. I won't go into heraldic detail, but this is quite an unusual way of subdividing a shield. And I'm showing it alongside another shield, another seal from a woman of the later medieval period, just to show how different this shield of Beatrice really is. This is a seal in which a woman, a married woman, shows the arms of her father, but also her three husbands quite separately. So she is, if you like, identified by an association with her father and her three husbands, but they are not brought together in a single entity. So they are there separately displayed. And I was struck by the difference with Beatrice's shield, that she has created, or had a seal maker create for her, an image which can only be Beatrice herself at one particular moment in time. And I felt that this fusion of these elements into a single heraldic entity was particularly interesting. And just to give you confirmation that we have there the arms of her third husband, Richard Burley. This is an image of his lost funeral effigy in St. Paul's Cathedral. And there you can see a version of his coat of arms squeezed onto the seal that Beatrice had commissioned not long after his death. And this association with Richard Burley takes us to the next great example of Beatrice's art patronage. In old St. Paul's Cathedral, there were, of course, a series of tremendous monuments, not least to the great Duke of Lancaster, John of Gaunt, the younger son of King Edward III. And Thomas Roos, Beatrice's second husband, and Richard Burley, her third, were both very close confidants of John of Gaunt. Richard Burley actually fought on his behalf in a number of military campaigns and was very richly rewarded for his loyalty. He actually followed John of Gaunt when he made a play to capture the crown of Spain. And this, I'm afraid to say, all went very badly wrong. And John of Gaunt's army was beset by plague, and Richard Burley was actually one of those who fell foul of plague and died while abroad. In his will, he refers to Beatrice as my very dearest companion. And in the will, he actually entrusted to Beatrice the commission for the making of his tomb. And on the plan of Old St. Paul's Cathedral, I've just put a ring to indicate where Richard Burley's monument was to be found. But more importantly, Richard's monument was slap bang opposite one of the most costly monuments ever made in the medieval period. That is to say, the monument of John of Gaunt himself. This monument cost in excess of £1,000, which is a spectacular sum of money in the Middle Ages. And although we only can glimpse these monuments through antiquarian drawings, it's clear that they were quite substantial structures. And on Richard Burley's monument, this was drawn by William Sedgwick in 1641, not very long before the cathedral was destroyed and demolished as a consequence of fire. We can see that Richard Burley reclines in effigy on the top of the monument, but he is identified by coats of arms in the gable, one of which is his own coat of arms, the one on the right-hand side gable, and on the left we see that same tripartite division of a shield, which identifies the second shield as that of Beatrice de Roos. Now, interestingly, Beatrice did not choose to be buried with Richard Burley, but she did also, in addition to having this monument made, she also founded a chantry so that prayers would be said for the repose of his soul. She included herself, her second husband, and her own parents in the commemoration associated with the chantry. So she did, as it were, have herself commemorated, albeit not in effigy, in this monument in St. Paul's Cathedral. And rather sadly, when she died, she was actually buried alone, it would seem, at Water Priory, not very far from York. And sadly, for me anyway, there is no trace now of this medieval church remaining, and no sign of Beatrice's own monument. But in a very real way, Beatrice's real monument is the St. William window in the Minster. This is a view, it's very difficult to see the whole of the window in one view. So what you're seeing here is a view at high level across into the northeast transept. In the Middle Ages, the high altar would have stood in this bay. So the light of St. William on the north side and the light of St. Cuthbert on the south side would have been shining down on the high altar. And that's where one would get the best possible view of this particular window. And there it is on plan so that you can see its location just to the north of the high altar. And the little blue markers show where there are stone representations of Roos arms, and the yellow dots show windows in which the arms of various members of the Roos family appear. And this gives you, I think, a strong impression of how important the Roos family had been in the patronage of York Minster at different points in the construction history of the cathedral. This detail shows you the lower six rows of the St. William window, commemorating, of course, St. William of York. He died in 1154 and he was canonized formally in 1226. So next year we will be celebrating the 800th anniversary of his canonization. And I'm pleased to say that we can now say a lot more about the patronage of this particular window. The window, of course, depicts the life and the miracles of St. William, who was enshrined just behind the high altar with a secondary devotional site at the east end of the nave. So for a pilgrim, you could literally go on a journey of sites associated with St. William that would culminate visiting the shrine very close to this great window. It's one of the biggest hagiographical narratives ever created, and it was created by John Thornton, the glazier best known for the creation of the Great East Window a few years beforehand, which of course was also conserved relatively recently. Compared to the East Window, I would argue that making the St. William window was an even more challenging undertaking because for the East Window, Thornton was working from established biblical sources. For the St. William window, he had no one single source that would provide him with scenes sufficient to fill a window of this size. So he, working together with his theological advisors, needed, of course, to find a way of putting together out of literally nothing a series of exciting scenes that would tell this story. And I think you can see even in this extract of the window how well he's succeeded. But along the bottom, that's the focus of my interest, because we can see effectively at the head of her family on the extreme right-hand end of the bottom row, an image of Beatrice, and she is accompanied there by apparently two married men, both of them identified by Roos surcoats, and four younger men. And when one looks at the genealogy of the Roos family, it's clear that this can only represent Beatrice accompanied by her oldest surviving son, William, with his wife, and William's 5 surviving sons, one of whom was already married by the time the window was conceived. The subject matter of the window, as I mentioned, is the life of St. William, but more importantly, it's also about his miracles. And this, of course, is important because of the location of the window so close to the high altar, but more importantly, so close to the shrine, because it's serving almost as an advertisement for the efficacy of pilgrimage to the shrine of St. William. It tells you, come to York, specifically come to the Shrine of William, and you can expect a successful outcome for your devotions. And in that regard, the window is not unlike the Becket series in Canterbury Cathedral, which similarly lays great stress on the importance of coming into contact with the shrine of the saint himself. I think it's important too that in this set of miracle scenes, there's a strong emphasis on the participation of women in this miraculous narrative. This is the case in the sources. They were not manufacturing an artificial predominance of women participants in the stories of St. William, but I suspect that in the selection of scenes and in the introduction of the subject matter to the potential donor, Beatrice de Roos, it was very helpful to the chapter of York to be able to point out that William was a saint who took a particular interest in the well-being, spiritual and physical, of women. So the very first posthumous miracle that we see being performed by St. William, and this is on the left-hand side of the screen, is one placed very centrally in the central light of the window. And William is sort of shown with these radiating rays, and this is the first of his healing miracles in which he heals a young girl who we are told came from Leeds. So this is also, I think, important that, William is a miracle worker for York and for the Archdiocese. And in the saving of testimony for the canonization process, much of the information actually tells us where these people came from. On the right-hand screen, we see a leprous woman who is being cured at the shrine. And this is a very moving, I find, very moving scene, because in the story of this poor afflicted woman, we're told that such was her disfigurement that she had actually become estranged from her family and particularly from her husband, and never left her home. She was so unwilling to be seen by her neighbours. But through the intercession of William, she is healed and she and her husband are reconciled. And I think that's a story that, has resonance for all of us in particularly in our post-pandemic experience. This idea of social isolation, I think, is one with which we can very easily connect. This is a particularly entertaining story. As my colleague Christopher Norton, whose research into the miracle cycle is so important, as he has pointed out, this is really a unique story. We don't know of any other episodes in which somebody is poisoned by a frog. But we see here a sort of cartoonish sort of series of events. So reading left to right, a woman who's quite modishly dressed sits down at her table. She seems to have sliced the top off a loaf of bread, and in the middle of the loaf we can just see a sort of purpley shape which represents the frog. She accidentally consumes the frog and begins to experience considerable discomfort, so much so that she's actually taken off this elaborate, very long belt that she was wearing around her gown, and she's obviously loosening her clothing for comfort. And thankfully, St. William intercedes on her behalf when she goes to the shrine, and the frog, who is now on the ground, again, I hope you can see the little purple blodge at the bottom, he is expelled from the woman, and she's able to put her belt back on again and give thanks to St. William. And you can see, as in many of the scenes in this window, there are always witnesses in close proximity who point and gesture and I think suggest amazement at having witnessed this miraculous event close to the shrine. And another one, this is a woman saved from drowning in the River Ouse, and you can see that the portable reliquary of St. William, which was carried in procession around the city, so another form of pilgrimage in which William is very significant. The reliquary is carried over Ouse Bridge, which was the site of probably the best known of William's miracles, when he prevents people from drowning as the bridge collapses. And this is a sort of reprise, if you like, with William's reliquary serving as the saint by proxy, if you like. And we can see the procession is going over the bridge, and nobody seems to have noticed that the man in red has just sort of called everyone's attention to the fact that his wife seems to have slipped down the bank and into the river. But thankfully, St. William miraculously hears his cry, and the woman is rescued without harm. And we then see her processing with the reliquary, showing in her gestures that she's prayerful and thankful for her deliverance. And I can well see that those who were planning the window, who were discussing it with John Thornton, were preparing a sort of an agenda which would appeal to a wealthy woman who had been widowed 3 times and who therefore, through the dower system, has access to very considerable resources. She's already, by this time, I think almost certainly commissioned this remarkable monument, which was probably made by a man called Henry Yeaverley, the King's Mason. So she's been identified, I think, by the Minster as a very likely person to be interested in the St. William window. So Beatrice really was barely recognised as part of this window in the historic record. Earlier observers noticed that there was apparently a woman in panel 1E, and I'm showing you a couple of photographs, one taken in 1895 and another in about 1955. The commentators of the day recognised it was a female figure, but they assumed that the window must have been given by William Roos and that this was some kind of female relative as yet unidentified. In fact, at least one writer suggests that it was one of William's daughters. But in fact, when we began looking at the conservation of the window in great depth, we were also looking at antiquarian records of its earlier history. And a very important source was a drawing made in 1670 by a man called Henry Johnson. And he drew little sketches with heraldic details marked on them of the donor figures from the window. And there is Beatrice kneeling at the bottom of the window, and he describes her as occupying, as he called it, the 5th station. So reading left to right, she's in the 5th light, which means that given the orientation of the window, she is in the most easterly location, and all the donor figures, as you may recall, are facing east towards the high altar and the place of greatest importance in the minster. But what is very intriguing is that, as you can see, Johnson records her heraldic clothing looking rather different from the way we see it today. So on the we can see the so-called water budgets of the Roos family against a red background on the front of her garments, but the cloak over her shoulder, which is on the left-hand side of Johnson's drawing, does not show the blue glass that we see now, but instead the notable chevron on a golden background that we see in the coat of arms in the clerestory of the nave. And I think that what we can also discern from Johnson's drawing is that by placing Beatrice in isolation in a panel on her own, John Thornton has emulated a design feature that we encounter in the Great East Window. This is just a selection from the bottom of the East Window, and you can see that the man who gave the Great East Window, a man called Walter Scurlaw, is actually singled out for a solitary panel to himself in the centre, the most honorific position in the East Window, and he is flanked by triplets of seated figures on either side. And this, I think, is important for understanding the way in which Beatrice is given visual prominence in the Great East Window, in the St. William window. But I just want to return to her use of heraldic signifiers. In this particular slide, I'm showing you on the right-hand side this conventional depiction of a married woman's coat of arms. In other words, her natal or her father's coat of arms appears on the left-hand side of the shield. Her husband's on the right-hand side of the shield. Her husband's coat of arms appears on the left-hand side. Now, in heraldic terms, this actually means that her husband is given the position of prominence because that's the so-called senior dexter part of the shield. And I'm just putting alongside this version of a conventional shield in the choir clerestory two examples of other women heraldically attired. So from the St. William window, we see John Roos, Beatrice's grandson, accompanied by his wife, Marjorie Despenser. And you can see the front of her clothing is decorated with the Despenser arms, i.e. those of her own father, and her cloak is decorated with the arms of her husband's family, the Rooses. And this is comparable, I think, to the way that the conventional coat of arms of Beatrice appears in the choir clerestory of the Minster. Elizabeth, Lady Denham from Long Melford, similarly has her family coat of arms on her dress and her husband's coat of arms on her outer cloak. So again, you have a visual comparison comparable to the conventional impalement of a married woman's coat of arms. But of course, if we actually do a little bit of trickery, as one of my colleagues at the York Ladies Trust kindly did for me, we can see that this woman who was playing around with heraldic identity on a seal was also actually bending the rules a little bit in the way that her portrait is represented in the St. William window. She has her husband's coat of arms on her gown, but on her outer garment, she originally had the coat of arms or the arms of her father. So she, in fact, has flipped the so-called impalement of the coat of arms and given her own birth family the more prominent position. And I think when we see a digital reconstruction, it suggests that she would have stood out visually even more strongly in the original version of the window as it was first made than is the case even today. This flipping of impalements and the manipulating of heraldic rules is not unknown, but it's almost always associated with elite men. And one of the most famous examples of this process is, of course, in the coat of arms of Richard II. Richard II chose to give that senior position of honour to his royal ancestor, Edward the Confessor, the royal saint. And of course, this is most famously expressed on the exterior surfaces of the famous Wilton diptych in the National Gallery. And another example of this was actually closer to home in terms of our interest in Beatrice de Roos, because on the effigy of John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, on his effigy, and we know what it looked like through a series of drawings by William Sedgwick. And we see here he is the arms are shown, and unusually, and indeed Sedgwick felt the need to draw attention to this, we see at the top what Sedgwick says, where the arms of Castile and Leon have the preeminence as belonging to a king's daughter and heir. This monument of John of Gaunt was a double monument. John of Gaunt appeared in effigy, but alongside his third wife, Blanche of Castile, and she was, as we are reminded here, the daughter of the King of Spain, and it was through his wife that John of Gaunt hoped to lay claim to the throne of Castile and Leon. It was not to be, and so this impalement of the arms of England with those of Castile and Leon in such a way that the Spanish shield gets preeminence was relatively short-lived. Once it became clear that John was not going to succeed in becoming King of Spain, he reverted to using a more conventional form of the royal heraldry. So I think Beatrice is doing something very interesting in this window, and she's using heraldry in a way that is more commonly associated with men. And I'm just returning to showing you the base of the St. William window as it was seen in 1670. And this was, I think, certainly the correct order for the members of the Roos family. And indeed, when the window was conserved most recently, and we are now finishing a book which commemorates this activity in time for the canonization next year, we were able to make a case that allowed us to put the panels of both the William narrative and also the images of the donor back in what we believe to be the correct order. So at long last, Beatrice is there literally at the head of her family with her son and his 5 sons kneeling behind her. Now, what I think is particularly interesting about this depiction of the family is that it is not, in fact, a naturalistic and accurate record of a family tree. And I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but there are some extremely interesting omissions from the depictions at the base of the window. Importantly, for example, Beatrice does not show herself accompanied by her Roos husband, Thomas, the fourth Lord Roos, who had predeceased her. Indeed, as I've mentioned to you, she had actually married a 3rd time, Richard Burley, I think a love match, because he was very much her, well, not very much, he was quite considerably her social inferior. So she doesn't appear with her husband, and indeed her oldest son, John, the 5th Lord Roos, had also predeceased her, and he is not commemorated at all in this window. And nor are her son William's daughters. So Elizabeth, Margaret, and Beatrice, the youngest, obviously named for her grandmother, they are not commemorated either. So this, if you like, is a kind of edited version of a dynasty. And I think this is because Beatrice has chosen a snapshot of a dynastic moment in time. She came from a family where it was not uncommon for the eldest heir not to live long enough to inherit the titles and the properties of their father. Her own eldest son had died. Her own brother had lost his eldest heir. There was quite a long history of the fragility of dynastic succession. But Beatrice was the mother of several sons, and importantly, her eldest surviving son, William, who is shown here with her, was himself the father of sons. And we see 5 of the sons present in this window. Now, interestingly, in the event, 2 of the young men shown at the base of the window also did not live to have families of their own, but thanks to the fecundity of the Roos family, the family continue. And one of the young men in this window, who had originally, I think, been destined for the church, survives to become the next Lord Roos in succession to his father and his brother. So here, I think we have, in many respects, Beatrice's true monument to herself, her success as a dowager, a successful mother, a successful grandmother, and indeed, of course, as a patron of the arts. And I'm just going to close now with 2 panels that conclude the narrative in the St. William window. All of the scenes in the window we have now successfully identified as deriving from one or other of the various sources that were being drawn upon to construct the story that goes into the St. William window. But in the very final two scenes, we have this intriguing combination. A richly dressed elite woman, she wears an ermine hat with a brooch in the centre of it. She's dressed in a gown of red, despite the fact it's slightly corroded, but I think you can see she's dressed in red. She seems to have experienced some kind of accident involving a horse. I'm not quite sure whether she's been run over by the mounted man on the left-hand side or whether she's actually been on the horse herself and has sort of slid off the back of it. I can't say. But she is certainly subsequently seen praying at the shrine of William and apparently, I think, giving thanks for her escape from injury or death. And I found a very intriguing reference during my researches into the activities of Beatrice. I know that she was actually very keen on hunting because during her second marriage to Thomas Roos, John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, one of the most powerful men in the realm, actually gave permission for Beatrice to go hunting throughout his estates near Pickering, as long as she didn't do too much damage to his hedges. Now, I can't really say exactly what kind of hunting she was participating in, but it does suggest that she was not a stranger to what we might more politely call country pursuits. And I'd like to think that possibly at some point in her youth, Beatrice had had a very lucky escape from injury or death for which she attributed the encounter with St. William. And that, I think, concludes the window, the story of the window. It concludes the narrative cycle in the window. It is not, I think, accidentally the case that these two scenes appear almost directly above the figure of the kneeling Beatrice at the very bottom of the window. So I hope I can persuade you that these are two more glimpses of Beatrice de Roos in late medieval art. And I think that's a good moment for which I can conclude. And I'd be happy to take any questions if you have any. Thank you.
Wow. Okay. Well, that was fascinating. And I love the idea that the reason she was specifically a patron to the window was potentially that she was saved and credited St. William for it. I think that's a really nice idea. And well, I mean, the window suggests it. So
Well, I can't prove it, Jenny, but on the other hand, it's always fun to have a little bit of speculation going on in
yeah, I
think
think
we'd
we've
all
got
lose
to.
interest.
So questions, we've had a few. I'll feed some to you now. So starting at the top, where was the chantry that Beatrice de Roos commissioned after the death of Burghley? Where was it based?
It was actually in St. Paul's Cathedral, in Old St. Paul's Cathedral. It was in we think it was closely associated with the monument itself. And the monument was directly opposite the double tomb of John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt's tomb was immediately to the left on the north-hand side of the high altar, so a position of quite considerable prominence in Old St. Paul's. And as far as we can tell, Richard Burghley's monument was on the aisle wall, almost directly opposite John of Gaunt. Richard Burghley was, I think, the only retainer of John of Gaunt who specifically asked to be buried close to the Duke. And I think that's a measure of the fact that he was, in fact, a very loyal and close retainer of John of Gaunt. So this is where the Chantry Chapel was established. It was actually established in 1408, so quite some years after Burghley's death. And we don't know exactly whether the monument was in existence for some time before the Chantry Chapel, but I'm tempted to think that the Chantry Chapel is being created at a period when Beatrice is turning her thoughts to her own mortality, and the chronology fits quite well with what we know is going on in York Minster at the same sort of time.
Very fantastic. Um, Beatrice's first husband doesn't seem to be mentioned much. She's obviously very young when they married. Was it just a case that her second and third husbands were more of a match or higher in society?
Well, no, in fact, her first husband, who was an earl, was in fact, strictly speaking, the social, the top of the social tree in terms of Beatrice's three husbands. On the other hand, he was extremely young when they were married. It was a political marriage. Her father, Edmund Stafford, was, I think, trying to get a foothold in Ireland in order to ensure royal authority was being maintained in Ireland. It's quite likely, I think, that Beatrice was married to him in name only. It was quite common for girls to be married at a young age in order to secure the alliance, but they would not actually join their husbands as literally as their wives until they were of age. And when her husband died, he was drowned actually crossing over from Ireland to England. She was actually in England at the time, which leads me to think she perhaps had not left her family home. And guardians have to be appointed for 12 months, which suggests that she had not actually reached her majority at the time. And she then, of course, is married off relatively quickly. She's married barely a year later to Thomas. So it was, I think, literally a brief encounter and possibly didn't leave any sort of emotional mark on Beatrice's life.
Wow. I hadn't even thought about the fact they probably didn't even meet.
Well, that's my supposition. The fact that she was so young, she's in England at the time of his death, it makes me think that possibly, she had not yet actually travelled to Ireland
Mm.
to join him in as his wife in a way we would understand the term.
Zoe asks, was it deliberate that in the windows the colours are mainly red, white, and blue? Were they the colours that they had at the time? Was colour choice limited?
Well, the colour choice could be quite wide, and in fact, in the east window, it's quite diverse. But red and blue were the two most expensive colours, and of course, the silvery white glass provides a fantastic foil. So I think it's partly an aesthetic choice, but it's also an expression of um, sort of expense, if you like. And within the window, there are a number of different shades of colour in the blues, and you can see there also this rather lovely sage green, which they favour.
Nice. And do we know what became of the De Roos dynasty?
Well, they carry on well into the 15th century. I have to say, it sounds an awful thing to say. I rather lost interest in them in the later period, but they carry on well into to the end of the 15th century. Their fortunes then began to decline, but thanks to Beatrice's success, if you like, they certainly. Were a very vigorous and successful family. Her son William supported the change of regime in 1399 when Henry IV causes the abdication of Richard II. They remain true and to the Lancastrian affinity, shall we say. Her son William became Treasurer of England briefly, so they were at this point, a very, very successful family.
Right. Um, Christopher says, wonderful talk. Huge thanks. He asks, the Roos family owned the estate at Waterfulford. Have you come across any references to that during your research?
No, I haven't actually. The in her will, she I've found it difficult tracking down some of the places that she is interested in. She had estates all over the place. And very recently, a colleague has come across that distinctive coat of arms that we saw on a seal as far afield as Norfolk, but I haven't yet found any more references. That's the next stage of this search, I think, really, is to try and tie down more of her associations, her landed associations, and I'm particularly keen as well to look into whether there's more evidence of other women of a similar sort of social status to Beatrice who are using heraldry in the way that I am personally convinced she is, you know, manipulating the rules in order to create heraldic identity. And that's my next sort of chapter, if you like, in this particular research.
We've got a question as to, do we know why and when the colour of her cloak changed from that red to blue?
Well, it's clear that by the end of the 19th century, the window had suffered damage. We know that by the time James Tor seized the window in the later 17th century, there'd been some kind of intervention, which meant that the bottom row of panels had actually been transposed and moved up a row. There was a very large monument placed below the window, which might have been the cause of some damage. So it's Johnson who glimpses this heraldic array. And then I think not long after then, there seems to have been some kind of intervention that caused damage to the figure. And when we next glimpse her visually in the photographic record from the 1890s, there are bits of the Roos coat of arms surviving, but other glass has been scattered. And of course, because it's a black and white photograph, it's difficult to be sure exactly which bits of her clothing might have been sort of used as patch repairs in the background. So exactly when that loss of heraldic identity happens is very difficult to pin down with great certainty.
We've got a comment here. Please hear that there's going to be a book on the window next year. Will the heraldic story from tonight be in the book, and will the
It will,
illustrations be
yes,
there?
yes. And in fact, the reconstruction drawing, I'd shown some people pictures of this and some time ago, and I suddenly realised that actually we really needed to sort of have a visual of what it might have looked like, because the more I looked at these other women with the prominent Roos cloak, as it were, over their shoulder, the more distinctive I realised Beatrice would have appeared in glass. And so one of my colleagues, Susanna Wise Jackson, very kindly made a reconstruction for me. And she's done it so skillfully that you have to look quite carefully to realise that actually it's a digital reconstruction. She toned the yellow glass down so that it didn't stand out like a sore thumb, but looked as perhaps Beatrice would have looked had her original cloak survived. And I felt that was such an interesting visual that it was worth including. So it will indeed appear in the book.
That's good. I mean, I'm very interested to hear more in the book and learn more about the window in general. But huge thank you for attending tonight, and huge thank you to Sarah. Thank you, guys. Bye.